before the pyramids pierced the sky, before kings carved their names into eternity, before even the first city rose from the riverbank. There was only water, endless, breathless, without horizon, and from that silence a god stood up. Tonight, we descend into the oldest memory of mankind, into a world where the sun was a divine heartbeat, where kings ruled as living bridges between heaven and earth, and where the fate of the cosmos depended on whether a river chose to rise. This is the beginning of Egypt, not the Egypt of monuments, but the Egypt of myth. And myth, as you will soon see, is never merely a story. Long before the first throne was claimed, before the double crown bound two lands into one will, the Nile had already begun its instruction. Each year, it rose like a breathing god. From the southern rains it gathered strength, swelling with opaque brown waters, spilling across the valley floor in a slow and sovereign flood. Fields vanished, boundaries dissolved. Villages clung to the thin margin between desert and inundation. Reed huts poised at the edge of obliteration, like sentinels guarding the threshold between chaos and order. And then the retreat. The waters withdrew with quiet authority, leaving behind a skin of black earth, dark, fertile, soft as clay shaped by unseen hands. From death came renewal. From drowning came abundance. And so the people learned their first doctrine. That destruction was not the end. It was a phase. The river was not simply water. It was a scripture written in silt. In the eastern sky, the sun rose clean from the horizon, as if lifted from a hidden mound beneath the world's first light. Hunters painted antelope and boats upon desert cliffs where the wind never slept. Men with raised arms stood frozen in ochre and ash, gesturing toward a sky that offered no answers, only repetition. Potters of early Nile cultures shaped red jars and pale vessels, adorned with dark-painted ships, horned cattle, birds gazing downward like silent judges. Ivory tags unearthed at Abydos carried incised marks, not yet words, not yet sentences, but something restless and awakening. A promise that names could be captured, that identity could be bound to matter, that memory might defy oblivion. On carved knife handles, like the one later found at Gebel El Arak, lions roared in frozen battle, long sleek boats clashed upon carved rivers, and the choreography of power unfolded in miniature relief. History had not yet begun, but power had. Across the long pre-dynastic centuries, belief gathered form from the margins of survival. The jackal who prowled the western escarpment, watching burial grounds beneath the dying sun, became guardian of the dead. The cow whose horns curved like a crescent horizon cradled the solar disk and became lady of the sky. The falcon, patient, circling high above river and stone, descended into imagination and perched upon the facades of palaces not yet built. The gods were not invented, they were observed. The creatures who ruled the edges of life became metaphors for what ruled the unseen. At Abydos, in the desert field later called El-Quaib, the tombs of early rulers pressed into the sand like grounded ships. Within them lay jars of beer and grain, stone pallets, carved tokens, sacrificed animals, grim offerings placed beside the silent. The living had begun negotiating with eternity. Food for the journey, servants for the beyond, names etched onto labels so that identity might survive decay. They had witnessed the flood return year after year. They had seen the sun rise without fail. Order could be maintained. If the river obeyed a rhythm, perhaps the soul did too. Then something changed. Symbols condensed. What had been mist became emblem. The Serek emerged, a stylized palace facade enclosing a royal name. And above it perched the falcon of Horus, sharp-eyed, unblinking, divine witness to human authority. The white crown of the south rose tall like a lotus bud. The red crown of the north curled forward like a poised serpent. These were not ornaments. They were geography transformed into law, myth forged into governance. Then came the slab of stone that fused ritual, conquest, and destiny. The Narmer palette. Upon its surface, a king in the white crown seizes his enemy by the hair, arm raised, suspended in eternal judgment. Above him, Horus grips a papyrus marsh by tether, claiming the delta reed by reed. On the reverse, the same ruler dons the red crown, leading procession through subdued lands. Two long-necked beasts entwine, restrained into symmetry. A bull crushes a fortified gate. This was not mere victory. It was theology in stone, order conquering chaos. The cosmos stabilized through royal will. The two lands were no longer territories. They were a single breath. At Heliopolis, priests spoke of the beginning. Before sand, before sky, there was none. Infinite, shoreless water. From its stillness rose a mound, the first ground, and upon it stood Adam, self-born. From his will emerged Shu, the dry breath of air, and Tefnut, the moisture of dawn. From them came Geb, patient earth, and Nut, the long-arched sky. Lovers separated so that day and night could exist. Their children, Osiris, Isis, Seth, Nephthys, would carry the pattern of kingship, betrayal, death, and resurrection. The priests named them the Ennead. Each sunrise reenacted creation. Each dawn was proof that the world had not abandoned itself. When the king nourished the cult of Ra, the cycle continued. When he failed, low floods and storm winds were feared as cosmic displeasure. Creation was not a memory. It was maintenance. At Memphis, another truth emerged. Creation was not flood. It was thought. The god Ptah conceived the world in his heart, the seat of intellect, and spoke it into being with his tongue. What was named became real. Gods were named. Cities were named. Fields, creatures, kings. Language fixed existence and order. This doctrine endured upon the Shabaka stone, its worn lines whispering that speech is architecture, that thought precedes form, that silence precedes power. In Thebes, priests invoked Ammonius, the unseen wind, older than gods, younger than dawn. Invisible, unpaintable, yet present in every shrine. He would merge with Ra as Ammonius Ra, hidden will and visible sun bound together. The divine was no longer only sky or river. It was breath itself, and the king, standing between earth and eternity, became the hinge upon which existence turned. In every version of creation, flood, egg, mound, word, one truth endured. Order must be chosen. The Nile could rise or fail. The sun could return or vanish. A king could uphold balance or invite collapse. Power was never decorative. It was custodial, and mortality, though inevitable, could be negotiated through memory, ritual, and name. Egypt did not fear death as annihilation. It feared imbalance, for to fall out of order was to fall back into none. Thus, before the first pyramid shadowed the desert, before stone mountains rose in defiance of decay, Egypt had already forged its true monument, a theology carved into river, sun, and breath. The gods were not distant. They were infrastructure, and in the silence before dawn, as priests stepped onto temple roofs and watched the red rim of the sun ascend, they were not observing a sunrise. They were witnessing creation begin again. It was not a quarrel with Heliopolis, nor a contradiction of Memphis. It was a descent into greater depth. What is visible is born from what is hidden, and what is hidden must be governed. The Egyptians gave that governance a name, Ma'at. Ma'at was not merely truth as spoken in argument. She was alignment. She was proportion. She was the unseen geometry that allowed existence to continue without fracture. She was the straightness of a judgment rendered without corruption. She was the calibrated stillness of a scale poised between innocence and guilt. She was the exact weight of a word spoken at the proper hour. Her feather rested upon the brow of a goddess, yet it also rested upon the conscience of a king. Without her, the flood would not know when to recede. Without her, the sun would not know when to rise. The oldest sacred inscriptions already breathe her presence. Deep within the narrow chambers of the pyramids at Saqqara, The walls of Unas and Teti bear the pyramid texts, lines carved into stone like veins carrying divine memory. These utterances speak of the first mound rising from Nun's abyss, of the sky goddess arching over the earth, of the dead king ascending to join the imperishable stars. They thunder, they whisper, they coil in riddles, yet beneath their poetry lies a sober assertion. Creation is not self-sustaining. It must be remembered. It must be renewed. The crown does not float alone upon the river. It is tethered to the sun and to the law that keeps the cosmic scales from tipping into ruin. Each temple oriented toward the east was more than architecture. It was a threshold through which the first morning was invited to enter again. Each hieroglyph cut into limestone fixed a fragment of the world into ordered permanence. Thus, the many beginnings, mound, word, egg, breath, were woven together into a single fabric. That fabric was Egypt. The sun rose each morning like a golden scarab pushed from the mouth of the eastern horizon, and with it rose responsibility. Dawn was not passive beauty. It was confirmation that the machinery of order had not failed in the night. At Heliopolis, the priests taught that Ra bore many forms within a single revolution of the sky. At dawn he was Khepri, the becoming. At noon he was Ra in sovereign strength. At sunset he was Adam, elder and complete, folding light into himself before descending toward the western hills. Night was not rest. Night was trial. In the hidden realm beneath the horizon, the solar bark traversed 12 caverns of shadow. Gods armed with knives and spears surrounded the vessel, and in the dark waters coiled the serpent of unmaking, Apophis, whose hunger was not for flesh but for hours themselves. Each dawn was victory. Each dawn was survival. But the king and his priests were not mere observers of this celestial passage. They were participants, co-architects of continuity. At Abu Ghurab, in the open courts of the sun temples, altars absorbed the blaze of midday. A pyramidal stone rose like the tip of the primordial mound, declaring that the first sunrise could be reconstructed through stone and inscription. Obelisks at Heliopolis, and later at Thebes, stood as petrified rays, sharpened spears of light piercing the heavens so that illumination might answer when summoned. In the west at Sahara, causeways stretched from the Nile's floodplain toward valley temples, and from there to mortuary complexes where kings awaited eternal sustenance, fed not merely by bread and beer, but by spoken remembrance. Everywhere, the same warning lingered. The sun is a cycle, but cycles can break. Egypt existed to ensure that it did not. The daily temple ritual mirrored the river's rhythm. Before first light, the purified priest immersed himself in the sacred lake, shaved away the marks of ordinary life, clothed himself in linen untouched by common breath. He approached the sanctuary as one approaches a sealed cosmos. He broke the clay seal of the shrine and opened the doors as though unsealing the horizon itself. Before the divine statue, he presented a small figure of Ma'at, held carefully in both hands. Truth and balance were offered before incense, before bread, before praise. Without alignment, nourishment was meaningless. He washed the image in cool water, anointed it with cedar and myrrh, clothed it in fresh linen and gold. He arranged bread, beer, roasted fowl. He perfumed the chamber. He traced protective gestures in the air. Then he withdrew, sealing the doors so the god might partake unseen. At noon, the ritual returned. At dusk, again, light changed color, but the obligation did not. The offering formulas carved into tomb walls began with the king's name, because the king financed eternity. Estates, granaries, vineyards, cattle, each linked through inscription to kitchens, to incense burners, to altars. When a priest declared, an offering which the king gives to Ra, to Osiris, to Hathor, he affirmed that the throne upheld its covenant. Food became magic in the presence of a name. Magic became law in the presence of a king. Above this structure stood the ruler, who called himself son of Ra. His titulary bound him to the solar disk. His crowns, the white and the red, proclaimed not mere territorial union, but cosmic integration. The said festival was the testing of that integration. Within the step pyramid complex of Djoser at Saqqara lies one of the oldest Jubilee courts, a vast stone theater of renewal. Dummy chapels line the enclosure walls. Doorways confront one another like silent magistrates. There, architecture itself becomes liturgy. In the 30th year of reign, and often thereafter, the king emerged in ceremonial robe. He assumed first the white crown, then the red. He seated himself upon paired thrones to demonstrate that both lands accepted his gravity. He ran between markers to display vitality. He offered to regional gods. He received the sanction of his solar father. Centuries later, Amenhotep III would celebrate multiple said festivals, proclaiming renewed youth as if drinking time itself. But the principle was ancient long before his reign. The festival declared that time would not erode the bond between throne and son, that Maat still rested beneath royal sandals, that the breath once filling Adam at the first dawn continued to fill the sovereign's chest. The people watched. They felt the year pivot as though creation itself had just occurred upon those flagstones. Meanwhile, scribes recorded livestock, barley, vineyards, ensuring that worship would not falter through scarcity. Myth was not confined to sanctuary chambers. It was budgeted, transported, tallied. The king did not simply recount the ascent of Adam from the mound. He enacted it. At dawn he stood upon elevated platforms as sunlight struck obelisks, turning stone to incandescent white. He did not merely praise Maat. He rendered judgments, cleared canals, punished thieves, counted grain. The day itself was a liturgy, sunrise and sunset marking its sacred margins. Between them moved the machinery of law. The gods sailed above. The king walked below. Between them, along the measured artery of the Nile, Egypt labored with disciplined faith. State religion did not reside solely in hymns. It lived in quarry marks on limestone, in timber dragged from distant lands, in barges gliding along canals stacked with jars of oil and beer like soldiers awaiting inspection. At Giza, causeways rose from floodplain to terrace in stone processions. The valley temple of Khafre still gleams with polished floors that remember the footsteps of priests. Nearby, the great Sphinx watches with leonine patience, silent guardian of royal continuity. At Saqqara, Djoser's complex unfolds like a petrified city of ritual. In hidden chambers, the king's statue gazes northward through drilled apertures, eternally surveying the imperishable stars. At Heliopolis, obelisks captured sunlight like spears. The Benben stone stood at the center, affirming that the first mound still rose symbolically in the heart of the nation. In all these places, religion gained mass. Every block cut, every canal dredged, every inscription carved. These were acts anchoring myth to earth. The Palermo stone and subsequent royal annals recorded temple donations with meticulous pride. To feed a god was to steady the sky. The priesthood that sustained this mechanism was ordered like an army. At Heliopolis, the high priest, greatest of seers, stood as first servant of the solar god. Beneath him served lector priests, custodians of sacred texts, bearers of spells whose syllables were believed to maintain structural integrity within the unseen. For beneath every visible monument lay an invisible equation. If Maat endured, the sun would rise. If the sun rose, the Nile would flood. If the Nile flooded, Egypt would live. And so the kingdom moved forward, stone by stone, ritual by ritual, trusting that the next dawn would answer. Not because it must, but because it was held in balance. The hierarchy of service did not end with the high priest and the lector. There were the Sem priests, draped in leopard skin, embodiments of controlled wilderness. It was they who performed the opening of the mouth, touching chisel and adze to statue and mummy so that breath might return, so that silence would not claim dominion. In that gesture lay a defiance of decay. Stone could inhale. Flesh could speak again. There were the pure priests, bodies shaved, limbs washed in sacred lakes before dawn. They moved through sanctuaries like pale birds through shadowed reeds, leaving no trace of common life upon the air. There were the countless Ka priests who tended funerary chapels, poured beer before false doors, replenished bread upon offering tables, so that the dead would not hunger in eternity. They did not labor chaotically. They served in rotation, 4 fills for houses of service, each taking its appointed month, so that the voice of worship never faltered. The shrine was never left unattended. The god was never left without greeting. Scribes stood behind this devotion with reed pens poised. Grain was measured. Cattle were counted. The Abu Simbel papyri from the 5th dynasty Sun temples read like the pulse of a breathing organism. Lists of daily bread loaves, tallies of geese and beef for feast days, inventories of incense, wine, oil. Even the crews of boats that ferried goods along canals were recorded with bureaucratic precision. Religion was not abstract. It was accounted for. The standard offering formula carved across tomb lintels began with the king, because the king guaranteed continuity. An offering which the king gives to Osiris, lord of Abydos. An offering which the king gives to Anubis upon his mountain. 1,000 of bread, 1,000 of beer, 1,000 of oxen, 1,000 of fowl. The thousands were not poetic excess. They were economic aspiration. Behind each 1,000 lay a field cleared after the flood, a granary sealed against damp, a herd tallied beneath an unforgiving sun. Piety required agriculture. Theology required irrigation. When central authority faltered during the first intermediate period, the machinery trembled. Mortuary endowments lapsed. Sacred fields were seized by provincial strongmen. Chapels fell quiet. Hunger touched even the gods. Reunification under Mentuhotep II restored not only political unity, but ritual respiration. On the western bank at Thebes, he raised a mortuary temple merging cliff and colonnade, state and sacred reconciled in stone. The mountain itself seemed drafted into theology. When the court moved north to Ichtai in the Fayum Basin, the old sanctuaries were not abandoned. Senusret I, son of Amenemhat, endowed the growing precinct of Karnak Temple Complex, strengthening the cult of Ammonius, whose hidden nature resonated with an age seeking both expansion and equilibrium. At Abydos, new chapels honored Osiris, and pilgrims left stele along sacred walls like a river of carved petitions. Royal decrees exempted temple lands from certain levies. Fisheries, vineyards, gardens enriched divine estates until the houses of the gods became vast landlords. Yet the crown remained vigilant. Temple offices, though honored, were drawn within the gravitational field of the palace. Wealth was granted, but loyalty was expected. Workshops attached to temples produced faience amulets, linen vestments, fittings for sacred barks, cosmetics for anointing, standardized beer for altars. On festival days, processional barks departed Karnak and traveled to Luxor amid a tide of raised hands and urgent prayers. The carved ears upon temple walls symbolized divine attentiveness, assurance that private despair could reach cosmic hearing. The cult economy fed bodies and fed meaning. A farmer delivering barley to a temple granary understood that some portion would become divine sustenance at dawn, and that remnants, sanctified, would return to human tables at dusk. The same grain circled between mortal and divine. Thus the wheel turned. Sunrise lit shrines that were also institutions, centers of accumulation and redistribution, so steady they lent Egypt an illusion of immortality. Yet night came unfailingly. The western desert rose like a colossal gate and received the sun. The people watched the disk descend and understood that this was transit, not annihilation. The river had educated them. Retreat precedes return. Fields brown before greening. The moon withers before rebirth. Death, therefore, could not be silence. It required guidance, preservation, naming. The earliest graves cut into dry sand had accidentally preserved flesh. That accident hardened into doctrine. The human being was not singular but composite, a constellation of elements requiring care. The Ka was vital breath, sustained by offerings. The Ba was mobile personality, bird-bodied and human-faced, capable of wandering by day and returning by night. The Ak was the transfigured spirit, effective and luminous among the imperishable stars. The Ib, the heart, held memory and would face judgment. The Run, the true name, anchored identity. Even the shadow carried ontological weight. To lose one aspect was to risk a second death, erasure not of flesh but of remembrance. Against this threat, Egypt developed a craft both meticulous and reverent. By the era of step pyramids at Saqqara and radiant monuments at Giza, embalming had become a disciplined art practiced in the place of purification. Resin scented the air. Floors were washed each morning. The priest of Anubis, masked in jackal form during sacred moments, directed procedures with ritual precision. The brain was extracted through the nasal passage to preserve the skull's integrity. Organs were removed, treated with resin, and placed within canopic jars guarded by the sons of Horus, each under divine protection. The body was bathed in palm wine, then packed in natron so moisture fled and corruption stalled. 70 days marked the sacred interval, time enough for salt to perform its alchemy and for families to prepare eternity's provisions. After desiccation, the body was anointed, cavities filled with linen and resin, amulets positioned at strategic thresholds. The Wedjadi for wholeness, the Jed pillar for stability, the knot of Isis for protection. Wrappings followed in patient layers. Chants accompanied each band of linen. Finally, a mask, cartonnage for modest houses, gold for the exalted, restored recognizable form so that the Ba would not wander in confusion. What began as fortunate preservation in desert sand evolved into theology embodied in linen. Tombs expanded from pits into mastabas, rectangular benches of mud brick and stone. Within lay chapels for offerings, shafts descending to burial chambers, false doors carved to resemble passageways through which the Ka might receive sustenance. Walls displayed estates, hunts, workshops, images not decorative but functional, ensuring memory retained its context. At Saqqara, the step pyramid of Djoser elevated stacked mastabas into a stairway of stone, a ladder for royal ascent. Around it spread a ceremonial city, where jubilees were rehearsed in perpetuity. At Giza, causeways connected river and pyramid-like arteries feeding a monumental heart. Within hidden chambers, the king faced north toward circumpolar stars that never set, celestial companions of permanence. Inside the pyramid of Unas, and those of Teti and Pepi thereafter, sacred spells were carved into stone itself, the earliest religious corpus still legible. These pyramid texts did not merely describe ascent. They enacted it in language. Through inscription, breath returned. Through ritual, memory endured. Through architecture, mortality was negotiated. Thus, Egypt constructed not merely monuments, but continuity. A civilization determined that neither gods nor men would vanish into unmeasured dark. The inscriptions of the pyramids do not whisper. They ascend. They speak in the sovereign voice of a king who mounts invisible ladders toward the firmament, who joins the solar bark at dawn, who journeys beside Ra as flame crowns the horizon, and who, when night unfurls its vast indigo veil, reclines within the celestial body of Nut. In death, he becomes Osiris, dismembered and restored. In renewal, he rises as Horus, hawk-eyed and sovereign once more. This was not poetry alone. It was engineering of eternity, the language of stars, of sacred boats, of bulls crowned with lunar discs. These were not metaphors drifting in reverence. They were instruments. Words, when carved into limestone in chambers aligned with constellations, became hinges upon invisible doors. Spoken by consecrated mouths, they did not merely describe ascent. They enacted it. As theology matured, preservation became architecture. Within hidden chambers, serdabs sealed from the casual world, statues of the departed stood in still vigilance. Their stone eyes peered through narrow apertures, fixed upon shafts of filtered light and the faint geometry of offerings beyond. They did not move, yet they watched. They received. The ritual known as the opening of the mouth unfolded with grave precision. Adzes of consecrated metal touched lips that would never again draw mortal air. Incense smoke wound itself into linen folds. Milk and bread were presented in measured sequence. Each gesture reawakened a faculty: breath, speech, taste. The body was instructed to remember life. This was not denial of death. It was its correction. Families erected stelae within chapel courts, inscribed with offering formulas that began in the name of the king, for royal authority underwrote even the divine kitchens. Yet beneath the titulary grandeur were humble names: carpenters who shaped cedar beams, soldiers who bled beneath desert suns, women who kept households ordered, and whose laughter once filled shaded courtyards. Water was poured for the ka. Names were spoken, so that the run would not dissolve into the silence between stars. When misfortune struck the living, letters were written to the dead, pleading, admonishing, imploring intervention. Bowls were left in tomb courts with droplets of beer as recompense for attention. The relationship did not fracture at burial. It transformed. There was no frenzy in these acts. There was method. The embalmer's blade, the priest's litany, the family's offering. These formed a braided cord strong enough to draw a soul across the black river that separates pulse from memory. Decay was not ignored. It was studied. The body was opened with ritual knives, purified with natron, bound in linen woven like quiet prayers. Resin sealed the work, speech consecrated it. The Egyptians understood that the soul was a dwelling whose architecture could be restored, if the blueprint was honored and each wall named in turn. When mourners sealed the tomb, and a priest murmured that the West would receive this new Osiris, grief did not erupt into chaos. It settled into order. The family returned toward the river's brightness, knowing they had aligned themselves with cosmic law. They had placed a human life into the architecture of the sun. By the era of warrior kings, the afterlife unfolded not as abstraction, but as mapped terrain. Scribes unrolled long sheets of papyrus, smoothing them with dampened palms, and inscribed in black and red the chapters of the Book of the Dead, known to them as the Book of Going Forth by Day. Within its measured columns were passwords, gate names, transformations to assume, waters to cross. Ignorance, not death, was the true peril. Most solemn among its declarations was the confession within the hall of two truths. There, beneath the gaze of 42 assessors, the heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. Each denial: I have not stolen, I have not slain, I have not diminished the offerings, was not recited to persuade. It was spoken to align the self with cosmic equilibrium. Beside the scales stood Anubis, adjusting the beam with the care of a master artisan. Recording the verdict, reed poised with serene authority, was Thoth. And crouched in dreadful patience waited Ammit, composite of crocodile, lion, and river horse. A final hunger prepared to consume a heart made heavy by its own betrayals. To shield against the frailty of flesh, a greenstone scarab was placed upon the chest, bound with chapter 30b. A plea to the heart not to rise in accusation against its bearer. The surviving papyri preserve these moments with unnerving clarity. The papyrus of Ani displays the scales luminous as frost. The papyrus of Hyenfer shows a wife grasping her husband's hand as if companionship might steady judgment. In each, the vindicated soul is proclaimed true of voice and welcome to the field of reeds. Canals straight as rule lines, barley towering above human height, labor transformed into serenity. Around the wrapped body assembled an army of helpers. Shabdi figures, faience or carved wood, stood ranked with hoes and baskets. Chapter 6 commanded them. If summoned to labor in the blessed fields, they would answer in place of their master. Wealthy tombs held hundreds, overseers among them, forming a silent nation pledged to eternal service. Organs rested within canopic jars bearing the heads of the sons of Horus, guarded by goddesses, enclosed in shrine-like chests. In the burial of Tutankhamun, the viscera lay sealed in miniature golden coffins within alabaster that drank lamplight like milk. A heart amulet guarded the chest. A jed pillar fortified the spine. The knot of Isis promised vitality. The Ankh proclaimed life as covenant. Nothing was ornamental. Beds with leonine feet awaited rest in the field of reeds. Boats with painted eyes promised passage through western canals. Wine matured in sealed jars as though the tomb were a cellar anticipating return. The kings of the new kingdom abandoned visible pyramids for a hidden ravine west of the Nile. The valley beneath a peak shaped like a natural pyramid. In the Valley of the Kings, corridors cut into limestone descended like rivers turned to stone. Walls bloomed with funerary cosmographies. The Amjuat charted 12 hours of darkness through caverns and lakes of fire. The Book of Gates named thresholds and their vigilant guardians. The Book of Caverns revealed hidden depths where enemies of the sun were punished and the blessed nourished from secret waters. In the tomb of Thutmose III, figures sweep across plaster in spare ochre lines as though the underworld were drawn from a single inhalation. In the chamber of Seti I, reliefs sink deep and gleam with colors ripe as split fruit. And in the sealed tomb of a boy king, nested coffins turned the burial chamber into a conflagration of gold, hope hammered into permanence. Above ground, in the workers' village of Deir el-Medina, artisans copied sacred chapters onto limestone flakes, rehearsing words until they flowed without tremor. They carried fragments home, adding personal prayers for wives and children, bridges across mortality built from practiced ink. The valley became a ritual map. Star-spangled ceilings arched overhead. Each corridor announced an hour of night. Each chamber promised rebirth if only the names were uttered in proper sequence. The secrecy of the place was confession. Pyramids had proclaimed too much. Rock-cut tombs concealed treasure and theology alike. When danger rose, priests returned under cover of darkness to relocate mummies, caching kings together in humility that preserved what grandeur could not. In this vision of death, there is no capitulation. Despair finds no dominion. Morality is rendered law, memory magic. The heart remains the ledger of a life, and the gods read with unwavering calm. If balanced with the feather, a door opens that does not close. These papyri and painted walls are not curiosities. They are contracts. The living vow sustenance through offerings and remembrance. The dead vow protection, sending cool northern winds across fertile fields. The sun vows to rise. The land vows abundance, if Ma'at is upheld. For centuries, in valley chambers and village courtyards alike, this exchange endured without fracture. The river taught Egypt that existence moves in cycles. The books taught that cycles endure through knowledge and devotion. And so they believed, fiercely, without apology, that a human being, rightly tended and rightly named, could step aboard the bark of morning and never be refused. Abydos lies where desert edges close upon the river, where wind lowers its voice among ridges of pale sand. At Amelkuaib, where the desert presses close to the Nile and the wind drifts low over ancient ridges of sand, the earliest kings cut their tombs into the earth. The graves were not yet monuments of overwhelming stone. They were chambers sunk into the body of the land itself, measured, deliberate, intimate with the soil that would one day reclaim them. The living came bearing jars of beer and small bowls carved from limestone. They poured and placed and spoke names into the heated air. No offering was casual. Each gesture was an assertion. The dead endure if the living remember. In time, memory became myth. Whispers gathered around one ancient tomb and declared it the resting place of Osiris himself, the murdered king who had crossed beyond mortality and returned as sovereign of the unseen. Pilgrims arrived from distant nomes. They set up stele along sacred walls in ordered rows, each stone bearing a name and a plea. May I be remembered before the Lord of the West. Abydos transformed into a theater where statecraft and eternity intertwined. Within the temple raised by Seti I, walls unfold a procession of royal names. The Abydos king list, etched as though the reigning monarch had summoned his ancestors to witness his devotion. Lineage became liturgy. Authority became inheritance sanctified by time. Behind that temple rests the Osirian, a sunken stone chamber encircled by water, massive and austere. Its cavernous hall suggests a tomb not for man, but for a god who died and rose again. There, architecture becomes theology in granite. Water encircles stone as chaos once encircled creation. Depth implies resurrection. Each year, in the month of Seed, priests lifted a wooden shrine and placed it upon the sacred boat called Neshmet. The procession moved from temple through town and across desert paths toward the ancient burial fields. It unfolded not as spectacle alone, but as reenactment of cosmic crisis. First advanced Wepwawet, opener of the ways, his standard raised high, clearing unseen roads through visible dust. Behind him rose the ritual laments of Isis and Memphis, voices braided with grief and invocation. Their mourning was not despair. It was summoning. Then came the staged conflict, companions of Horus against adherents of Set. Order wrestling disorder before a crowd that understood the stakes were agricultural as well as cosmic. If Horus prevailed, barley would rise. If Seth dominated, the fields would harden beneath sterile wind. At last, the shrine of Osiris reached its resting place. Priests planted figures molded in the god's form, filled with Nile silt and barley seed. Watered and left in darkness, they would sprout green shoots within days. Life emerging from the shaped body of death. This was theology made visible. An official of the 12th dynasty, Ikernefret, left an inscription describing how he prepared the bark of Wepwawet, fought the enemies of Osiris, and purified the path. His account is sober, administrative, almost restrained. Yet within its measured lines lies confirmation. These were not symbolic dramas. They were believed to sustain the fabric of existence. Abydos became pilgrimage for an entire civilization. The poor left simple pots scratched with their names. The wealthy endowed chapels and commissioned reliefs. All hoped proximity to the god would bind their mortality to his renewal. The myth that shaped kingship began long before these festivals and deepened with each generation's retelling. It begins with Osiris, just ruler, bringer of agriculture and law. He taught humankind to cultivate earth, to divide bread fairly, to honor the divine order. His brother Set, powerful, desert-born, fierce as the red wind, envied this harmony. Set murdered Osiris and scattered his body across the land. Isis searched with relentless devotion, gathering each fragment. She wrapped them in linen and, through words heavier than iron and more enduring than bronze, restored breath to what had been broken. From their union came Horus, concealed among marsh reeds until strength filled his limbs and vision sharpened in his gaze. When grown, Horus stood before the gods to claim his father's throne. The tribunal assembled without haste. In the narrative preserved within the Chester Beatty Papyrus I, the Ennead sits in deliberation. Set boasts of brute power. Horus asserts rightful inheritance. Isis employs cunning to expose truth. Thoth heals the wounded eye of Horus, restoring wholeness as symbol of balance regained. Neith offers counsel that legitimacy rests with the sun. At the verdict, Ra and the divine council award the crown to Horus. Set is not annihilated. He is assigned domain, thunder, storm, defender of the solar bark in its nightly peril. The myth refuses simplification. Power is acknowledged. The desert has purpose. Storms must be harnessed, not denied. Yet rule is declared moral. Kingship belongs to lawful continuity and to the restoration of equilibrium. The divine court becomes template for human governance. Every pharaoh reigned within this pattern. In life, the king was Horus, the falcon emblazoned upon his sarek, the restored eye gleaming. In death, he became Osiris, sleeping yet potent, father to the next Horus who would assume the white crown of the south and the red crown of the north. The royal titulary encoded theology as grammar. The Horus name, the two ladies, the golden Horus, the throne name enclosed within the cartouche alongside the personal name. Stone became syntax of sovereignty. Coronation dramatized legitimacy over force. The ruler accepted crook and flail, offered ma'at to the assembled gods at dawn, and pledged opposition to isfet, chaos, falsehood, imbalance. When turmoil preceded accession, reliefs implied that Horus had once again subdued Set. When justice was rendered, texts declared that the king presented ma'at as his first act each morning. In Thebes, during great festivals, oracles responded to petitions with subtle movements of divine bark borne upon priestly shoulders. A forward sway signified assent. A backward shift denied. Judgments were inscribed as echoes of that primordial tribunal between Horus and Set. At Abydos, at Osiris, at Memphis, variations of the Osirian cycle unfolded. At Temple of Edfu, later reliefs carved under the Ptolemies recount battles between Horus and Set across marsh and lake, an eternal reaffirmation of verdict. A farmer in the delta planting an Osiris bed in damp soil. A noble wearing the wedjat eye upon his chest. A queen bearing the title god's wife of Ammonius, lifting the sistrum in procession. Each lived inside the same assurance: order can return. A rightful heir can mend fracture. Myth in Egypt was not diversion. It was constitutional law. It was covenant between dead and living. In the season of planting, Abydos became scripture in motion. Priests raised the shrine of Osiris onto the Neshmet bark and followed a route part road, part remembrance. Musicians set rhythm. White-robed bearers carried baskets and jars. Laments of Isis and Nephthys rose and fell like torchlight flickering in wind. Mock battle erupted once more. Order prevailed so that seeds might rise. At the burial field, Osiris gardens were planted, figures of earth and barley watered with Nile mud. Within days, green would pierce brown soil. Proof that life answers death. Elsewhere, temple walls at Dendera Temple Complex recorded festival calendars month by month. Incense recipes, sacred cakes, processional routes linking forecourts, birth houses, and river harbors. Roads themselves became monuments of belief. At Karnak, an avenue of sphinxes once stretched toward Luxor, a stone river along which Ammonius traveled annually so the city might behold its god and the god his city. During the beautiful festival of the valley, Ammonius' bark crossed to the western necropolis where cliffs rise like ribs of the earth. Mortuary temples opened. Families feasted among tombs, sharing bread with the blessed dead as if a vast ancestral household had gathered at dusk. In the festival of Opet, Ammonius, Mut, and Khonsu journeyed from Karnak to Luxor temple. Crowds pressed near. Petitions were lifted like fragile vessels. Oracles answered in measured sway. At Deir el-Medina, villagers recorded appeals to Ammonius and to deified kings when disputes fractured their small community. They believed the god listened. Votive stele carved with ears proclaimed sanctuaries as places where prayers were heard. In such hours, the boundary between sanctuary and street dissolved. The god emerged from shadow into sunlight and dust. The city itself became tribunal and procession, grief and renewal braided together. For the Egyptians, destiny was not passive submission. It was participation in a design older than dynasties. Power required balance. Mortality required remembrance. The gods required reciprocity. And so long as names were spoken, seeds planted, judgments rendered, and festivals walked beneath the burning sky, the covenant endured, river, throne, and tomb bound within a single unbroken story. Kings, when confronted with fracture, did not answer first with steel. They answered with ritual. They learned to speak in the language of procession and prophecy, to bind wounded provinces not merely with armies, but with myth made visible. For in Egypt, a throne was never secure by force alone. It endured when it could be read as inevitable within the grammar of the gods. After the convulsions of the first intermediate period, when rival courts fractured the two lands and famine shadowed the floodplain, it was Mentuhotep II of Thebes who reunited the country. His victory was not proclaimed solely on battle reliefs. It was carved into stone against the cliffs of Deir el-Bahari, where his terraced temple rises as though mountain and monument clasp one another in austere embrace. There, geometry becomes reconciliation. Columns ascend toward sheer rock face, as if human order presses itself against the raw body of earth. In that solemn amphitheater of stone, Mentuhotep aligned his kingship with Osiris, sovereign of resurrection, and with the martial vigor of Montu. He presented himself not merely as conqueror, but as Horus who restores equilibrium after chaos has exhausted itself. The message was deliberate. Civil war had been a descent into Isfet. His reign would be a return to Ma'at. The Middle Kingdom refined this art into something sharper, sacred politics rendered with literary precision. The prophecy of Neferti, framed as a prediction spoken in an earlier court, yet likely composed under Amenemhat I, foretold a savior king rising from the south to heal a land in ruin. It was less prophecy than mirror, angled to reflect legitimacy back upon the new dynasty with divine radiance. Narrative became coronation. In the story of Sinew, exile and return unfold beneath the shadow of royal mercy. The aged wanderer is welcomed home, clothed for burial by his sovereign. The king acts as steward of Ma'at not only in judgment, but in ensuring a proper tomb. Even in fiction, governance is measured by how one prepares the dead. Under Senusret III, temples at Karnak and Abydos flourished. Pilgrim traffic swelled along river and desert road alike. The throne and the gods appeared to row the same celestial bark. When the Hyksos were expelled after years of foreign dominion, Ahmose did not simply declare military triumph. He inscribed the restoration of temples, the reopening of sanctuaries, the rekindling of offerings. Victory was framed as the reanimation of divine breath. Temples had been silent. Now they inhaled again. This pattern persisted. Under Amenhotep III, colossal courts and pylons at Luxor were constructed not only as architecture, but as stages for the Opet procession. The yearly journey of Ammonius would pass beneath his name, inscribed high upon stone. Procession became proclamation. His successor by ambition of spirit, Hatshepsut, filled her temple at Deir el-Bahari with scenes of divine birth. Ammonius approaches her mother. Khnum shapes her ka upon a potter's wheel. Kingship is not inherited. It is crafted in the workshop of creation itself. The message was unambiguous. She did not seize the throne. She was fashioned for it before memory began. In the shadow of the great Sphinx, Thutmose erected his dream stela between its paws. He recounts how the ancient colossus, half buried in sand, spoke to him in sleep and promised sovereignty if he would clear its body. Rule, in this telling, is covenant, care for ancestral sanctity in exchange for divine favor. The Ramesside age transformed festivals into theaters of royal presence as much as divine grace. Ramesses II lined the Nile with pylons, colossal statues, and courts aligned with processional routes. Jubilees proclaimed vitality. Reliefs recounted battles and treaties alike. Calendars inscribed precise ritual sequences for every feast day. Time itself was choreographed. Oracles shaped politics as intimately as they settled village quarrels. Ostraca and Stele from Thebes and Deir el-Medina preserve appeals to Ammonius and to deified kings. Divine sway determined inheritance disputes, boundary claims, even succession questions. A forward tilt of the shrine meant affirmation. A backward motion signified refusal. The high priest of Ammonius grew powerful because he bore the god daily through streets that believed. When the world darkened under theological upheaval, when Aten was elevated above all others and ancient cults fell silent, the rupture cut deep. After that brief monotheistic blaze, the young Tutankhamun issued his restoration stela. He declared temples ruined, offerings ceased, gods estranged from their shrines. Now altars smoked again. Statues were clothed anew. This was not abstract policy. The people had seen divine barks carried through their streets. They had tasted bread sanctified by offering. To restore a festival was to restore covenant. To relight incense was to rekindle cosmic dialogue. Thus, passion plays, processions, and oracles were not adornments around sovereignty. They were its frame. In harvest month, Osiris gardens greened within days, life bursting from mud-filled effigies. During Opet, Ammonius entered the heart of the city. In the beautiful festival of the valley, the god crossed to the necropolis and families feasted among tombs, sharing food with their dead as though mortality were merely an adjacent chamber. The throne spoke through rhythm. The people answered through participation. When war threatened, kings vowed to rebuild shrines. When famine struck, priests consulted archival records to determine which offerings once secured a generous inundation. In tranquil years, rituals turned steadily like a millstone, grinding belief into daily assurance. Egypt endured not by accident of geography alone. It endured because it knew how to make belief walk beneath the sun, how to carry myth from sanctuary into marketplace, from temple shadow into dust-filled avenue. In the season of sowing, Abydos once more became scripture in motion. Priests lifted the shrine of Osiris onto the Neshmet bark and moved along a route braided from road and remembrance. Wepwawet advanced as opener of the ways. Musicians set cadence. White-clad bearers carried jars heavy with grain and beer. The lamentations of Isis and Nephthys rose and fell like wavering torchlight. A ritual combat erupted, companions of Horus against adherents of Set. Order must prevail so that seed might pierce soil. At the burial field, priests planted the Osiris gardens once more. Barley within mud-filled forms would green in days. The stela of Ikernofret recalls how a royal envoy prepared the bark, fought the god's enemies, purified the path, faithful as any soldier at frontier. At Temple of Edfu and Dendra Temple Complex, walls recorded festival calendars month by month. Incense mixtures, sacred cakes, precise routes connecting forecourts to river harbors. Processional roads became arteries of theology. An avenue of sphinxes once stretched from Karnak to Luxor, a stone river along which Ammonius traveled yearly, so the city might behold its god, and the god might behold his city. During the beautiful festival of the valley, Ammonius' bark crossed westward to Necropolis cliffs rising like ribs of the earth. Mortuary temples opened. Families feasted among tombs as though the boundary between living and dead were no thicker than evening air. In Opet, Ammonius, Mut, and Kansa journeyed between Karnak and Luxor. Oracles answered petitions along the way. The gods swayed. The bearers felt the verdict in weight and motion. In such moments, sanctuary dissolved into street. Divine will moved beneath open sky, and kings, attentive to this current, spoke in its cadence when unity faltered. They understood that a fractured nation could be mended if it believed the gods had resumed their breath. To rebuild a temple was to mend the sky. To restart a procession was to steady the sun. So long as festivals unfolded in appointed season, so long as Ma'at was offered at dawn and names were spoken at dusk, the covenant endured. Power in Egypt was never merely possession. It was participation in an order older than stone, deeper than river, and patient as the stars that never set. The temples did not merely reopen. They inhaled. Stone that had known silence began to remember its own voice. Offerings rose again in pale spirals toward the vaulted darkness above the sanctuaries. Names once half erased were carved anew with deliberate hands, as though history itself were being stitched back into alignment. In the courts of Luxor Temple, vast pylons rose like horizons of carved sandstone. Colonnades extended in measured rhythm, designed for the sacred procession of Ammonius during the festival of Opet. The god would not move through anonymity. He would pass beneath the names of kings, beneath reliefs declaring devotion, beneath inscriptions that declared, "We restored what faltered." And restoration in Egypt was not nostalgia. It was cosmic repair. The architect and sage Amenhotep, son of Hapu, stood at the hinge of this renewal. He understood that stone could persuade eternity. He built not only for the present gaze of priests and courtiers, but for the future judgment of the unseen. Before him, the formidable Hatshepsut had inscribed a deeper claim. In her temple terraces, she carved a theology of legitimacy. The god approached her mother. The Creator shaped her upon a potter's wheel. She did not seize a throne, the reliefs whispered. She was formed for it in the first workshop of existence. Power, in Egypt, required origin stories written in the language of divinity. Later, the young Thutmose IV would leave a testament between the paws of the great Sphinx at Giza. The monument, half buried in sand, had spoken to him in dream. "Clear the sand," it commanded. "Restore what time has neglected, and kingship shall be yours." It was a covenant between memory and authority. Care for what is ancient, and the future will kneel. In the Ramesside age, spectacle expanded until ritual and kingship were inseparable. Ramesses II lined the riverbanks with pylons and colossal statues whose stone eyes surveyed the passing processions. Jubilees proclaimed vitality. Reliefs proclaimed victory. Treaties were carved as permanent as oaths before heaven. Yet beneath the triumphal images lay a quieter architecture, calendars dense with prescribed rites. Each day named, each offering measured, each chant timed to the turning of stars. It was choreography against chaos, time itself disciplined into obedience. Oracles did not remain within sanctuaries. They walked into the alleys of Thebes. Ostraca from the village of Deir el-Medina record petitions placed before divine statues. Disputes settled by sacred nod. Work foremen appointed by divine indication. Officials rebuked through ritual consultation. The high priest of Ammonius became not merely a cleric, but the living voice of the hidden god to a city that believed movement of the bark meant movement of destiny. When darkness returned, when the singular brilliance of Aten eclipsed the older cults and temples stood abandoned, language of restoration rose once more. The young Tutankhamun issued his decree. Sanctuaries had fallen. Offerings had ceased. The gods had turned their faces away. Now altars smoked again. Statues were clothed again. Processions returned. No lesson was required. The people had seen Ammonius carried through their streets. They had tasted the bread sanctified by contact with divinity. To restore a festival was to restore covenant. To revive ritual was to mend the unseen fabric binding heaven and earth. Thus the festivals were not decoration around power. They were its skeleton. In the harvest month, Osiris gardens burst green from handfuls of earth. During Opet, the god visited the living heart of the city. In the valley festival, the living embraced their dead not as shadows, but as companions. The throne spoke through these rhythms. The people answered. When war darkened horizons, kings vowed to rebuild shrines. When famine thinned faces, priests consulted archives to rediscover which offerings had once secured a generous flood. In tranquil years, rites turned steadily, grinding faith into the daily bread of assurance. Egypt endured because belief did not remain abstract. It walked in sunlight. It moved through streets. It touched stone. And when night fell, the grandeur of temples receded. Another guardianship emerged. Courtyards cooled. Lamps guttered. Jackals called from canal banks. Beneath painted rafters, families slept watched by smaller deities, fierce and intimate. At the footboards of beds stood Bes, lion-maned, knife-bearing, grotesque by intention. His protruding tongue mocked the terrors of darkness. His very ugliness was a weapon. He frightened what crept unseen. He danced upon mirror handles. He rattled laughter into the shadows above cradles. Nearby stood Tauret, upright hippopotamus, heavy with pregnancy, crocodile-backed, holding the sign of protection. She had known the violence of river beasts and had become its master. Her image hung across the bodies of expectant mothers like a vow that difficult births would not claim another life. Together with leonine guardians, serpent tamers, and knife-wielding spirits, they formed a perimeter around the hearth. From Middle Kingdom houses came ivory wands carved in crescent shapes, dense with protective beings. Dwarfs striding with blades, serpents twisting, frog-headed women poised in vigilance. These were not ornaments. They were boundaries drawn in air and belief. Circles traced around laboring women. Words spoken with gravity. The river's former destroyers, hippopotamus and crocodile, were invoked as protectors. Power had been domesticated. Even the gentler deities entered homes. Hathor arrived in music and perfume, cow-eared and luminous. The sistrum rattled. The Manat necklace swung. Joy itself became offering. Batek curled around thresholds, both beloved pet and sacred presence. Bronze votives accumulated across the delta. The companionship between cat and family matured into devotion. Joy and piety were not opposites, they were reflections. Even foreign observers such as Herodotus recorded festivals at Bubastis where boats filled canals, music echoed, and laughter rose toward the sky. Beneath the celebration lay a conviction: delight honors the gods. Shared wine steadies existence. Amulets became the grammar of this daily theology. The eye of Wadjet guarded against fracture and envy. The Jed pillar straightened what had fallen. The knot of Isis bound blessing around blood. And beneath all of it, beneath temple, procession, oracle, household charm, rested a force older than pyramid stone. The Egyptians called it Heka, not illusion, not deception, sanctioned potency woven into creation itself. In ancient coffin spells, Heka speaks in the first person, claiming precedence even over gods. Creation, it implies, is sustained by utterance. The Memphite theology teaches that the world was conceived in heart and spoken with tongue. Name gives being. Speech directs form. If existence was born of thought and word, then rightly spoken formulae were not metaphors. They were adjustments to reality. At dawn, the king invoked Heka as he raised Ma'at before the hidden statue and pronounced offering words. In village huts, midwives traced protective circles and recited names with equal seriousness. Belief touched craft. Craft touched destiny. Thus Egypt did not rely solely on monuments to endure. It relied on repetition, on calendars obeyed, on songs remembered, on gestures performed at correct hours, on the conviction that power, when aligned with order, could be persuaded to remain. The great temples crowned kings and nourished the sun. But it was in bedrooms, birthrooms, and kitchens that eternity was quietly defended. And so long as word, image, and intention remained aligned, the cosmos did not fracture. It breathed. The Ankh was not an abstraction. It was life made visible, loop and crossbar, horizon and breath joined in one sign. It promised vitality with the clarity of water poured into an empty cup. No argument, no philosophy, simply the assertion that existence, when aligned with order, may continue. Scarabs pressed with spells, or bearing only a name, rested warm against the chest. Their curved backs mirrored the morning sun pushing itself above the desert line. They whispered toward the heart in silent insistence, "Be light when the scales await you. Be unburdened when eternity measures what you have carried." Material was not decoration. Material was intention given substance. Blue and green faience shimmered like floodwater over fertile fields. Those colors were not chosen for beauty alone. They invoked renewal, vegetation, the promise that the Nile would return. Carnelian glowed like captured sunlight and was trusted to stir vigor into flesh grown weary. Lapis lazuli summoned the deep night sky and the braided hair of gods who walked among stars. Gold was not merely precious, it was the flesh of Ra made tangible. In workshops at Lahan and Memphis, trays of faience amulets were fired by the hundreds. Molds pressed the same sacred forms again and again, ankhs, eyes, pillars, knots, until repetition itself became prayer. The kiln roared like a low chant. Form multiplied, protection democratized. A buyer did not require priestly mediation to receive benefit, though blessing in a chapel tethered object more tightly to deity. A mother could purchase a cluster of amulets for her child as readily as bread for the evening meal. Protection was not reserved for courts. When tied at a traveler's wrist or laid upon the chest of a newborn, these shapes were not ornaments. They were grammar, syntax of hope against uncertainty. Heka, creative potency, did not halt at protection. It healed. The medical papyri reveal no separation between herb and him. In the Ebers papyrus, remedies for coughs, swollen bellies, aching teeth, and burns that refuse to close are written beside incantations to be spoken aloud. Honey and grease cover wounds while the healer addresses unseen forces and commands them to depart from flesh. The London Medical Papyrus offers treatments for pains of the womb and for bites delivered by creatures that loved the marsh banks. The Brooklyn Papyrus catalogues serpents and scorpions with almost scientific devotion, naming varieties, describing symptoms, predicting outcomes, while also invoking divine authority over venom. There is no quarrel between medicine and magic in these scrolls. They are twin hands. The practitioner serves Sekhmet when wrath must be cooled. He serves Thoth when precision of knowledge matters more than passion. He serves Isis when maternal devotion must overcome poison itself. Illness in these lines is real. Fevers burn, wounds fester, infants cry through nights heavy with fear. Yet the response is steady, measured, refusing surrender. The most vivid testament to healing Heka rises in polished stone, the Sippi of Horus. On these stelae, the boy god stands triumphant upon crocodiles, serpents coiled in his fists, scorpions subdued beneath his feet. Harm is grasped, reduced, dominated. Around the figure spiral texts recounting how Isis saved her child from venom and called upon Ra to reopen the channels of life. The great Metternich stela, carved in the final native dynasty, covers every surface with invocation and myth, a fortress of script against affliction. The ritual is both practical and sublime. Water is poured across the carved surface. It runs down incised words and divine figures, absorbing their form. The afflicted drinks this water. The liquid, having touched the script, now carries its structure inward. Just as offerings become divine when named, water becomes charged when written upon by sacred narrative. Matter receives word. Body receives matter. Healing becomes translation. In countless homes, smaller Sippi performed the same grace. A child stung by an insect drank water poured over a modest carving of Horus upon crocodiles. A mother recited memorized lines, her voice low but unwavering. Other rites moved fluidly between home and temple. A man wore a strip of papyrus inscribed against nightmares, bound in linen at his throat. A woman labored upon a birthing stool carved with the vigilant form of Tauret, so that the very wood beneath her bore witness to protection. Doorways were painted with lion-headed guardians barring entry to what should not cross. A traveling merchant carried a small shrine with a tiny image of Bes affixed to a stick, planting it beside the night fire in foreign soil. Protection traveled. The lector priest from a great temple might, for a modest fee, visit private homes. He would read from ritual texts, place bread and beer before a simple clay image, burn incense until the corner of the room carried the fragrance of sanctuaries. The poor were not excluded. Clay shaped by hand, and a name spoken with conviction could summon presence as surely as gold. Boundaries were watched. Harmful curses aimed at neighbors, or, worse, at the king invited punishment. Tales from later periods, when Greek and Egyptian traditions intertwined, tell of princes who collected books of power and misused them, only to meet stern consequence. Yet everyday Heka was not feared. It was duty, to protect a newborn, to cool a fever with plaster and prayer, to hang an amulet before travel, to plant a small Osiris garden in uncertain seasons. These gestures tethered households to the first morning of creation. In intimate spaces, the gods wore gentler faces. Ammonius might reign hidden and immense in Karnak, but in a courtyard he became a breeze begged for a child's comfort. Hathor was less a distant celestial power than the sweetness of beer shared after weaving. Badet was warmth and purring reassurance on cool stone floors. Bes was laughter after strain. Tauret was the steady hand during contraction when breath narrowed and the world contracted into pain. Myth did not vanish in these moments. It condensed. Names of Ra, Osiris, Thoth, Sekhmet, and Isis were still spoken. First stories were retold as though newly unfolding. Yet beneath flat roofs, mythology became craft, applied tenderness. Ivory wands carved with grinning guardians brandishing knives were not grotesque fantasies. They were courage rendered visible because people understood a simple truth. Fear yields before images of defiance. Small Stele received water because people believed words could enter matter, and matter could enter flesh. Heka spoken rightly was humanity's participation in creation. At dusk, when color drained from courtyards and hearth embers glowed like the last pulse of the sun, another Egypt spoke. Quietly, persistently, a clay image rested within a niche adorned by dried lotus and the trembling wick of a saucer lamp. A woman touched a pendant of Tauret and whispered for her infant's calm sleep. A reed pen scratched across a potsherd carrying a message to a grandfather long buried, trusting that the dead still listened. Temples crowned by pylons and obelisks commanded daylight, but religion breathed equally in rooms where bread steamed, linen rustled, and cats dozed. The house possessed its own liturgy. A shallow niche held a small stela showing attentive ears carved in relief, promise that prayer would be heard. A blue faience bess leaned against barley and henna. A model offering table awaited crumbs and drops of beer. Names were spoken. Air shifted. Childbirth drew divinity closest. When labor began, doorposts bore protective figures. A circle was traced with a wand carved from hippopotamus ivory, crowded with friendly demons brandishing knives toward invisible threats. The woman sat upon a stool in dim warmth. Midwives rubbed scented oil into tense muscles, singing the names of Hathor and Tauret. If possible, a lector priest recited the marsh tale in which Isis hid her son and shielded him from venom. Amulets of the knot of Isis touched the swelling belly. Breath grew ragged. Pain peaked. Then a cry, a rattle shaken by Bess. Laughter rising because laughter itself was warding. The crisis passed. The house exhaled. In days following, the infant lay in a garlanded cradle beneath a doorway inscribed with blessing. Water poured across a small Horus on crocodile's stela was given to drink, cool, sweet, heavy with script. Milk nourished flesh. Words nourished fate. The house became temple until strength returned. Healing moved between courtyard and sanctuary with calm continuity. A mother simmered figs and beer for a fevered child and whispered to Sekhmet to turn her burning face toward mercy. Thus Egypt's endurance was not secured solely by pyramids or coronations. It was secured in gestures repeated without spectacle. A pendant tied, a name spoken, water poured over carved stone, oil pressed into skin. Through such acts, the cosmic drama entered mud brick walls. And in those walls, beneath woven mats and painted rafters, humanity met the divine not as distant thunder, but as breath beside the bed. Creation continued there, A father bent over a burn that blistered and wept. He spread honey thick as amber and laid linen upon the wound with careful hands. Yet before the bandage was tied, he spoke, not to the flesh alone, but to the fracture within his own conduct. He confessed a quarrel left unresolved. He promised restitution. In Egypt, healing was rarely only physical. Discord, like infection, was believed to fester if ignored. The cure required balance restored in body and in conscience. If a scorpion's sting swelled a child's hand until skin grew taut and hot, the family brought water and poured it over a cypress carved with Horus triumphant, boy god standing upon crocodiles, serpents crushed in his fists. The water slid across hieroglyphs recounting how Isis saved her son from venom. They drank what had touched the words as though script itself could dissolve into blood and correct its disorder. The papyri, Ebers, London, Brooklyn, preserved this dual knowledge. How much was understood of plants and oils and poultices, and how much was entrusted to the power of naming. Each charm repeats the logic of the first dawn. That which is named loses a measure of terror. Disease addressed as an intruder may be commanded to depart. Creation began in utterance, therefore, utterance may amend creation. Speech is inheritance. To speak rightly is to participate in the architecture of the world. The dead were not distant. Across the river, their doors stood sealed in silent walls of tombs, yet their attention lingered among the living. When hardship proved stubborn, a man or woman might write to a departed mother, brother, or spouse. The tone was intimate, direct, grievances listed plainly, as one would speak across a table. One bowl preserves a husband's plea, that his deceased wife cease troubling him if he has dealt justly with their children after remarrying. Another ostracon records a grandfather beseeching aid for a sick child, promising a modest feast at the tomb in gratitude. These letters were carried to cemeteries, placed beside bread and beer. Love did not end with burial. Obligation did not dissolve beneath sand. In certain houses at Deir el-Medina stood limestone busts, human heads and shoulders with wide, attentive eyes. Ancestor figures, scholars call them. Families set flowers and food before them, whispering as before a listener who might answer in dream or fortune. The house was inhabited not only by gods, but by remembered blood. Nowhere is this intimacy clearer than in the workers' village of Deir el-Medina. Perched above fields, arranged in a disciplined double row of mud-brick houses, it sheltered the artisans who carved the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Their lives were measured with scribal precision, 8-day work cycles in the necropolis, followed by days of rest when sandals were mended, texts copied, beer shared. Their walls bore images of Bes and Tauret and the cobra goddess Meretseger, guardian of the pyramid-shaped peak overlooking the valley. Small chapels held stele carved with uplifted hands, or rows of ears alone, a stark declaration that the deity hears. One stela tells of a man named Neferabu who sinned and was struck blind by Meretseger. He prayed. He was forgiven. Sight returned. He vowed publicly to proclaim that the goddess is stern yet merciful. Piety was not abstraction. It was consequence lived and confessed. On an ostracon, a hymn praises Ammonius as the one who comes at the voice of the poor and rescues the timid from the strong. Another fragment preserves a dream manual, visions catalogued as favorable or ominous, with counsel for waking conduct. Even sleep required interpretation. When disputes arose, oracles were consulted. The god, born in portable shrine, swayed forward for assent, backward for refusal. Decisions were recorded with the same care given to carving a royal cartouche. Divinity entered civic life, and when wages failed during a difficult reign, these same artisans staged what history records as the first labor strike. They marched to a mortuary temple and cried their hunger before images of deified kings. It was not rebellion against belief. It was belief demanding justice from those who had ascended to godhood. They were practical and devout in a single breath. Songs drifted through their streets, love poems invoking Hathor as mistress of delight. A young man perfumed his hair with oil and waited outside his beloved's door, fevered by longing. The sistrum's music echoed in verse as in temple forecourt. Lovers called each other sister and brother in ancient idiom, promising myrrh and pomegranates, necklaces of beads. A woman declared she would seek her beloved as Isis sought Osiris, a pledge heavy with mythic devotion. The sacred was never distant from tenderness. On procession days, a god emerged in gilded shrine and passed along streets. Mothers lifted children to see. Men offered oil lamps and cornflowers, petitions for lawsuits or harvests. The shrine slowed when requests were many. The bearers felt the subtle pull of assent or denial. Later, the faithful ascended temple stairs and received bread or beer that had rested before the statue. Food now suffused with divine proximity. It tasted ordinary, yet confidence lingered on the tongue. In quieter seasons, families visited chapels, leaving bronze cats for Bothet or small cows for Hathor. Faience plaques shaped like ears and eyes and hands accumulated, a vocabulary of gratitude and hope. By the late period, oracle decrees written on papyrus were folded and worn as amulets. A divine word could be carried against the heart like armor. Beneath ritual flowed ethics. The Book of the Dead teaches that the heart must balance against the feather of Ma'at. The negative confession enumerates decencies both grand and simple. I have not stolen. I have not cheated the widow. I have fed the hungry. I have honored my parents. At Deir el-Medina, inscriptions echo the same plain morality. A house altar was not solely for asking favors. It was for remembering obligations. A man who drank excessively hung a wadjet eye above his bed and pledged restraint. A scribe who miscounted rations carried a written prayer tucked at his belt until restitution was made. A woman who spread harmful gossip left a loaf at Hathor's image with tears and resolved silence. Myth provided pattern. Heka supplied instrument. Daily life rehearsed conscience. Stand in a restored house at Deir el-Medina at late afternoon. The sun descends behind the ridge concealing royal tombs. Desert air breathes dry and ancient. A child's laughter trails along the street. Inside, a woman smooths a stela with her palm and lights a lamp. Her petitions are modest: safe childbirth, fever broken, quarrel settled fairly, jars filled after harvest. She names Bes and Taret, Ammonius who hears, Merit Seeger who watches. She gazes upon carved ears and trusts that listening occurs. In such a room, mythology narrows into intimacy. Creation is not solely a god rising upon the first mound from primeval waters. It is a circle drawn around a bed in labor. Judgment is not only a scale in a cosmic hall. It is a heart choosing mercy over cruelty at dusk. The gods stride in procession through the vast courts of Karnak Temple, banners snapping in desert wind. Yet they also rest quietly upon shelves where bread cools and smoke curls toward rafters. They incline their unseen heads when a weary father whispers protection over a sleeping child. Such continuity sustained Egypt through centuries. But the years of division began not with thunder, only a rumor rising from northern marshes, swelling, hardening, until it settled upon the chest of the two lands like an unseen weight. Foreign chiefs established their court in the delta where the Nile opens into many mouths and the marsh wind carries the scent of salt. They commanded the eastern harbors. They fortified the long waterways through which cedar and copper and rumor passed. They named their capital Avarice and assumed the titles of kings. Later generations would call them the Hyksos, rulers from hill country descending into green abundance. Yet they were not strangers in a crude sense. They learned quickly. They inscribed their names within cartouches. They employed scribes trained in Egyptian discipline. They made offerings in temples with correct gestures and measured hymns. But they were new. They brought horses that moved like storm wind across flat land. They brought the swift chariot, whose wheels carved arcs of terror in sand. They favored a storm god whose thunder rolled with Levantine memory, called Seth when clad in Egyptian vestments, and Baal when invoked in the accent of the coast. In Avaris, shrines rose where Seth absorbed foreign sky into Egyptian earth. The god of necessary violence took on broader shoulders. Lightning bent toward the delta. In private houses, prayers continued as they always had, before small altars beside bread and lamp flame. In royal courts, invaders adopted the southern language of majesty. Ritual, like water, sought its level. Yet at the river's bend in Thebes, a native line preserved dignity, like a blade kept honed in shadow. The gods watched from hilltop and quay alike, accepting new epithets without surrendering the old. The second intermediate period stretched taut, a rope drawn from opposite ends. In Thebes, men swore by Ammonius, the hidden one who listens in wind, and by Montu, bull of battle whose plumes trembled when chariots departed the gate. In the delta, men invoked Seth of Avaris, lord of storm and victory, his animal visage stamped upon seals. A tale grew between courts, that the northern king Apophis sent word to Sekenenra of Thebes demanding silence of hippopotamuses in a sacred lake whose bellows disturbed his sleep. The story reads as fable, edged with insult, yet beneath its humor lies truth. What was proper in one land was offense in another. The quarrel was framed as violation of Ma'at. The Theban kings made war into sacrament. The Stela of Camo speaks of pushing northward, breaking ships, reopening temples whose doors had grown silent. Behind the spear lay theology before strategy. To restore rights was to realign the cosmos. The frontier bled ideas as readily as blood. In Sinai, at Sarabit el-Kadhim, where turquoise was carved from rock, Egyptian hymns to Hathor mingled with the rough script of Canaanite laborers scratching early alphabets into stone. In delta towns, Levantine deities stood beside Egyptian forms on amulets and small stelae. Reshef the archer appeared fierce and protective upon a soldier's pendant. Astarte and Anat, riders of sea roads and war maidens, sometimes shared altars with Seth. Kadesh, goddess of sensual delight, stood upon a lion in panels destined for domestic walls where laughter was not sin. Egypt did not shatter before these faces. It bent, then it wove. Priests at Memphis and Heliopolis guarded high creeds of Ta and Ra without surrender. At margins, travelers welcomed any god who guarded the desert road. Ammonius gained titles naming him lord of foreign lands, folding the strange into familiar structure like a weaver introducing bright thread into enduring cloth. The Hyksos too absorbed. Excavations at Avaris reveal Egyptian ritual floors and burials shaped by native custom. Northern kings adopted regnal formulas and scribal conventions. Their storm god accepted Egyptian incense and hymnody, but adaptation did not dull Theban resolve. Sekenenra died bearing wounds upon his skull, marks of close combat preserved in bone. Chamos pressed northward and carved his defiance in stone so that gods might read it. At last, I captured Avaris and drove remnants into the Levant. Restoration followed conquest. Sanctuaries reopened, offerings renewed, walls repaired, shrines cleansed. Voices once muted rose without tremor. Yet memory of the storm lingered. Centuries later, a commemorative stela in the north counted 400 years for Seth of Avaris, as though even suffering must acknowledge the season of its adversary. The god of tumult remained necessary. Strength cannot be erased from a world that requires defense. Southward, another current joined the sacred river. In Nubia at Napata, beneath the shadowed cliff of Jebel Barkal, a local form of Ammonius was revered, ancient, fierce, immediate. When Theban armies entered Kush, they carried temples and hymns. In return, they encountered Deduan and southern powers whose memories were long. Traditions intertwined. In later centuries, Nubian kings would claim Egypt's throne and receive Ammonius' blessing from both mountain and river. Borders, Egypt learned, are not walls but marketplaces where gods are exchanged, adopted, renamed. Then change came not by invasion, but by vision. In Thebes, a young king born Amenhotep IV, beloved of Ammonius, turned his gaze toward the solar disk called the Aten. Within the precinct of Karnak, he raised open courts beneath unshielded sky. Forests of offering tables gleamed in sunlight. Limestone talatat blocks rose swiftly, bright and modular, reflecting new urgency. Here the sun did not illuminate a hidden statue in shadowed chamber. It fell directly upon bread, flowers, and slaughtered bulls. Hymns stretched long as riverbank. Light itself was presence. Devotion sharpened into exclusivity. The king renamed himself Akhenaten, servant of the Aten. Names of Ammonius were chiseled from stone, even within his father's cartouches. Shrines closed, revenues diverted. The old gods receded from public gaze. In his 5th regnal year, he sought a new horizon. Sailing northward, he chose a crescent of cliffs opening wide to river. Boundary stelae were carved into living rock, declaring the ground sacred to Aten alone. He named the city Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten. A city rose with astonishing speed. Broad avenues, palaces with painted floors depicting waterfowl and reeds. 2 vast temple complexes without roofs, their sanctuaries exposed entirely to sky. Thousands of white altars stood beneath unmediated sunlight. Within palaces, Akhenaten and Nefertiti appeared in scenes unprecedented in royal art. They sat beneath the solar disk whose rays ended in tiny hands extending ankhs to their nostrils. They kissed daughters. They leaned together in chariots. Bodies were rendered elongated, tender, vulnerable. The art was theology embodied. Life flows directly from light. The great hymn to the Aten, carved in tombs of courtiers, praises the sun that awakens birds, rouses herds, steadies ships upon river, and breathes life into Syrian hills and Nubian deserts alike. Day is gift, night is trial. When the Aten sets, the world lies as if dead. When he rises, hearts awaken. Under this creed, cavernous underworlds faded. Osiris receded. Judgment halls grew quiet. The emphasis shifted from afterlife to present illumination. The royal couple alone mediated worship. No cult statue received offerings. The Aten bore no anthropomorphic face. The disk and its rays sufficed. It was revolution without army. Light displaced shadow. Exclusivity displaced plurality. The cosmic balance trembled. For Egypt had long thrived by weaving many names into one fabric. Now a single thread sought dominance beneath an unblinking sun. And though the courtyards blazed with brilliance, beyond the horizon older gods waited, silent, patient, as if aware that night too belongs to the order of things. The sanctuaries had been stripped of their breath. The priests of Ammonius and of the older gods walked through courtyards where incense no longer burned, where offering tables lay bare beneath a sky that did not answer. Estates once rich with cattle and grain had been emptied to feed a single radiance. The revolution of light had promised purity. What it left behind was silence. In the tombs of Amarna, carved into the pale cliffs, courtiers wrote of a hope unlike the old hope. No weighing of the heart, no tribunal before Osiris. They wished only to stand forever in sunlight, to feel warmth upon their faces without judgment, without descent into caverns. It was a faith of immediacy. Yet even there, in the workers' village where dust gathered in the folds of daily life, small figures were hidden beneath beds and beside hearths. Beeswax charms, miniature forms of Tauret, guardian of childbirth, tucked into corners as if policy could not enter a birth chamber. Mothers still drew protective circles on floors when fevers rose. The state could command temples. It could not command fear. Faith in the household is older than kings. The end came without thunder. Harvests thinned. The air itself seemed to withhold blessing. Akhenaten died in his city of open courts, beneath cliffs that glowed red at dusk like wounded stone. The record fractures there. A co-regent flickers through broken cartouches. A queen perhaps, Nefertiti, ruling beneath another name. Or perhaps only rumor etched into eroded limestone. History at times is a body buried without ceremony. What is certain is this: a child soon wore the crown. He began as Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten. He became Tutankhamun, living image of Ammonius. The change was not cosmetic, it was cosmological. A restoration stela speaks with restrained indignation. Temples fallen into neglect, sanctuaries choked with weeds, gods turning their faces away from a land that had forgotten their names. Now the statues were clothed again, oil-touched foreheads of stone. Hymns returned to echo beneath roofs. Offerings resumed as in the first time, as if creation itself were being reenacted. The court withdrew from Amarna like a tide receding from an exposed shore. After the boy king's brief light, power shifted into seasoned hands. Hormheb, soldier and administrator, understood that rebellion against the gods had left fissures in both heaven and state. He issued decrees against corruption. He chiseled away the memory of heresy. He dismantled the city of the sun, stone by stone. The small limestone blocks that had once held blinding light were carried south and packed inside the pylons of Karnak, buried as filler within new monuments. A revolution entombed inside orthodoxy. Yet suppression does not erase consequence. The priesthood of Ammonius, once humbled, rose from this crisis stronger than before. The Ramesside kings poured wealth into temple treasuries with a fervor that bordered on compensation. Under Ramesses II, donations were recorded in the vast Great Horus papyrus with numbers so immense they feel architectural. Land, cattle, ships, workshops, tens of thousands of laborers assigned to divine service. Religion became infrastructure. The office of the god's wife of Ammonius, held by royal women, accumulated estates and ritual authority until it stood nearly equal to the high priest. Oracles in Thebes rendered judgments, appointed officials, guided processions that citizens believed sustained the pulse of the cosmos. Hymns to Ammonius rose with language so elevated that plurality seemed to tremble at the edge of unity. You are one beside whom there is none other. The memory of the Aten lingered, less as devotion, more as warning. A single god could burn too fiercely. After the thunder of empire, uncertainty unfolded like a tapestry tugged from multiple directions. Libyan dynasts rose in the delta. In the south, the high priest of Ammonius ruled in all but name. Egypt did not shatter, it diffused. Power was distributed through ritual rather than annihilation. Politics became liturgy. From Nubia, conviction approached with measured step. At Jebel Barkal, a cliff shaped like a coiled serpent cast its noon shadow over altars where Ammonius revealed himself to Kushite kings. Pi marched north not as a conqueror alone, but as a reformer cloaked in piety. His victory stela reads like a sermon in stone, rebuke for neglected rites, purification before battle, surrender accepted only after local gods were appeased. He claimed devotion to Ammonius of Napata and Ammonius of Thebes simultaneously, a theological bridge binding two mountains. His successors continued the weaving. Taharqa left pylons and colonnades at Karnak, shrines in Nubia, reliefs showing divine hands placing crowns upon mortal heads. Adoption ceremonies of the god's wife of Ammonius transformed succession into ritual choreography rather than civil war. Even when Assyrian armies descended like desert wind and Thebes suffered sack, the Kushite kings withdrew with scriptures intact. Empires fall, hymns endure. The late period opened with deliberate restoration. Santikai reunified the two lands and sealed unity through sacred adoption rites. At Sais, theology of the primordial goddess neath flourished anew. Artists revived old kingdom styles with reverent precision, as though memory itself were a form of resistance. Foreign merchants came to Naucratis, and Egypt did not recoil. Gods acquired new admirers without surrendering their names. Animal cults multiplied. Ibises for Thoth, falcons for Horus, cats for Batet, dogs for Anubis, each mummified body a votive whisper sealed in linen. The Serapeum at Saqqara received the immense burials of the Apis bulls, corridors of basalt echoing with hoofed sanctity. Belief expanded its library. The books of breathing condensed older funerary spells into portable assurance. Salvation democratized, yet still anchored in order. Then Persia entered. In 525 BCE, Cambyses too took Memphis and the Double Crown. Yet even he stood before Egyptian gods as tradition required. The statue of Ujahorisnet records how the foreign king was instructed in ritual courtesy, purified before approaching Neith. Later, Darius I built at Hybes in the Oasis, an inscribed canal steely invoking favor from Ra. Foreign names were written beside the title pharaoh. The oracles of Ammonius continued to nod yes or no. Through invasion, reform, heresy, restoration, federation, and conquest, one principle endured: Ma'at. Order was not fragile because it never depended on one man, nor one god alone. It bent, it absorbed, it buried revolutions within its own pylons. It adopted enemies into liturgy. It remembered and forgot with equal discipline. Empires marched across the Nile Valley like storms. But the deeper current was always the same. Power that ignores balance burns itself into stone. Power that kneels before order becomes memory. The god's wife of Ammonius held her estates in Thebes like a quiet sovereign of incense and grain. Choirs rehearsed hymns in shaded courtyards. Fields ripened under temple oversight as they had for centuries. The animal cults multiplied: ibis, falcon, cat, crocodile. Each life wrapped in linen becoming a vow made visible. Empires redrew borders. They recalculated taxes. They stationed garrisons along canals and deserts. But they did not silence the daily rite. At dawn, bread and beer were still placed before the gods. Lamps were lit. Libations poured. Egypt reassured itself that Ma'at could endure foreign crowns so long as the scales in the Hall of Truth remained level. And the sun continued to board his night bark without hesitation. When Alexander the Great entered the valley, those who followed him understood quickly. The Nile rewards those who speak its language. In Alexandria, the Ptolemies raised palaces that captured Mediterranean light and founded libraries where scholars gathered the written breath of nations. Yet in temple reliefs, these Greek kings appear in ancient crowns, offering Ma'at to the gods with hands held in gestures unchanged since the Old Kingdom. Their legitimacy required choreography older than their bloodline. They also elevated a god who could look both toward Greek harbors and Egyptian sanctuaries without contradiction. His name was Serapis. Scholars debate his birth. Some say his image was summoned from distant lands. Others that a sculptor in Alexandria shaped him anew at royal command. His ambiguity is deliberate. He fuses the depth of Osiris and the sacred bull of Memphis with the authority of Zeus and the shadowed gravity of Hades. Upon his head rests a grain measure, promise of abundance. At his side, the hound of the underworld reminds worshippers that death is not annihilation but threshold. In the Serapeum of Alexandria, colonnades framed perfumed air where Greek and Egyptian knelt together. Yet the Apis bull still held court at Memphis. The mysteries of Osiris at Abydos still drew pilgrims who planted barley in sacred shapes, enacting resurrection through agriculture. The new did not erase the old. It braided them. Isis moved beyond the riverbanks. Sailors invoked her for steady winds. Merchants offered first fruits of cargo in gratitude for survival. On Delos, her shrines gleamed beside treasuries. In the Piraeus near Athens, sanctuaries opened to those who called her mother. In Pompeii, frescoes depict her priests in white linen, censers breathing sweet smoke. In Rome, the Iseum Campens rose among marshes, obelisks transplanted like living cuttings into foreign soil. Her cult endured suspicion and favor alike because it offered intimacy. a covenant between mortal and divine in an age of shifting empires. One could whisper, "My lady," and believe the whisper traveled. Within Egypt, temples became encyclopedias carved in stone. At Temple of Edfu, walls recount cosmogonies where the first mound rises from primordial water and Horus receives dominion. Ritual dramas depict his harpooning of Seth's companions, each thrust preserving creation from dissolution. The inscriptions stretch across pylons like disciplined armies of hieroglyphs. At Dendera Temple Complex, capitals shaped as the face of Hathor look outward with serene joy. The zodiac ceiling, later carried far from its home, reveals how Egyptian thought absorbed foreign star lore and translated it into Nile theology without surrendering identity. At Kom-Ombo Temple, dual sanctuaries honor Sobek the crocodile and Horus the elder. River as both danger and guardian. At Philae, Isis ruled as sovereign of thresholds. Processions transformed water into sanctuary. There, centuries later, the final hieroglyphic inscription would be cut, a fading pulse in enduring stone. Language adapted without forgetting itself. In 196 BCE, priests crowned Ptolemy V Epiphanes and issued a decree at Memphis in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek. The stone would break and lie buried, yet the words endured, and the world would know it as the Rosetta Stone. Earlier decrees at Canopus and Memphis formalized reforms and victories, binding throne and temple in contractual piety. The crown endowed, the priesthood legitimized. It was mutual survival. Roman emperors accepted portrayal with crook and flail. Augustus inscribed his presence upon Egyptian gateways. Hadrian founded Antinopolis and transformed his drowned companion into a god whose cult echoed Osirian resurrection. Empire became myth. Myth stabilized empire. In markets, Greek and Egyptian words intertwined. In homes, amulets of faience, ankhs, wedjat eyes, were worn against misfortune. Mummified ibises filled catacombs. Bronze cats gleamed in Bubastis. Funerary papyri shortened for the poor, expanded for the wealthy. Portraits painted in tempera captured luminous eyes that refused oblivion. The old order dimmed slowly, like a lamp whose oil runs low yet whose wick still glows. In the 4th century, emperors who once poured wine before Serapis turned toward another symbol. Under Theodosius I, edicts rose like iron gates. Sacrifice was forbidden. Temples closed. Endowments seized. Practice varied from province to province, but the tide was clear. In Alexandria, the Serapeum fell, stone shattered amid prayer and proclamation. Some chroniclers saw triumph. Others heard lament. Yet gods do not vanish in a single night. They retreat into language, into memory, into gesture. For centuries more, villagers would trace protective signs on thresholds. Mothers would whisper names older than decrees. The Nile would flood. The sun would rise as scarab and falcon in the imagination of those who remembered. Power shifts. Scripts change. Empires kneel to new altars. But beneath conquest and conversion, the ancient question remains. Can order survive belief's transformation? Egypt's answer, across 3 millennia, had always been the same. As long as the balance holds, as long as the heart is not heavier than the feather, the world endures. At Dendera Temple Complex, at Temple of Edfu, at Kom-Ombo Temple, the chisels changed their allegiance. Crosses were carved into limestone once shaped for falcons and goddesses. Processional scenes were plastered over. Small chapels emerged inside courts where sistrums had once rung in praise of Hathor. Altars were set before gateways that had framed golden barks of Horus and Isis. The architecture endured. The language of worship shifted within it. At Philae, last citadel of the ancient rites, Isis held her island through diplomacy as much as devotion. Border treaties with Nubian tribes allowed pilgrimage to continue. Traders brought offerings for Mangelus and for the old Queen of Heaven, even while bishops in nearby towns denounced what they called shadows. In the year 394, upon the gate of Hadrian at Philae, a priest carved the final hieroglyphic inscription known to history. A brief prayer, a fading hand, a name that reads as Esmatacum. Within a generation, Demotic script too would fall silent. In the 6th century, under Justinian I, formal closure came. The statues of Isis were removed. Chronicler Procopius recorded that the sanctuaries grew quiet. The river did not. The Nile continued its patient rising and retreat. The people learned new prayers. Many stones remained where they had always stood, waiting for other names to echo against them. The Egyptian tongue survived by changing its garments. Spoken speech adopted the Greek alphabet, adding letters to capture ancestral sounds. In this new script, Coptic, the old language entered churches and monasteries, singing psalms with a cadence shaped by flood and field. The months of the ancient civil calendar endured. Thought still marked the year's beginning. The scent of ripe dates and cut reeds still accompanied the turn of seasons. Sacred time was baptized, not erased. In Upper Egypt, the desert became a new frontier of devotion. Anthony the Great sought silence among black hills, forging a path for hermits who pursued holiness as once kings had pursued conquest. Pachomius founded communal monasteries along the river, ordering prayer and labor with the precision of temple offerings. Shenut, at the White Monastery near Sohag, preached with fierce authority, rebuking wealth, condemning idols, defending the poor. Old temples stood within walking distance of new churches. Villagers petitioned saints for rain as their ancestors had petitioned gods. Christian amulets borrowed shapes long familiar, loops of life reimagined as crosses, protective eyes simplified into pleas for health. The Book of the Dead slept, yet new books of prayer promised heaven to the righteous heart. The mother and child became holy image. Some artists gave Mary the gravity and tenderness long associated with Isis. Similarity does not demand dissent, yet the visual echo lingers along the Nile's memory. Then came another transformation. Around 640, Arab armies entered Egypt with swift horses and the certainty of revelation. Fortresses fell. Treaties were signed. At Fustat near Memphis, the first mosque rose beside the river. Arabic replaced Greek in administration. Coptic endured in liturgy and village speech, stubborn as reed roots in marsh soil. Monasteries in Wadi Natron preserved manuscripts. The Archangel Michael was invoked as guardian of the flood. Luxor's ancient courts sheltered a mosque within pharaonic walls. A living testament that worship never abandoned the riverbank, only altered its direction. Islam brought scholarship and law, chroniclers and judges who measured justice with texts new to the land. Yet beneath shifting authority, habits persisted. Lights before images, calendars aligned with flood. The conviction that justice is balance, that spoken word shapes reality. The old faith did not shatter. It permeated. Centuries passed. In 1799, near Rashid, soldiers uncovered a dark slab bearing 3 scripts. A decree once issued under Ptolemy V. Epiphanes. Hieroglyphic for the temples, Demotic for the courts, Greek for the councils. Broken, reused, half-buried, yet intact in meaning. The Rosetta Stone became a key long misplaced. In 1822, Jean-François Champollion, drawing upon his love of Coptic, announced that hieroglyphs carried sound as well as symbol. Royal names, Ramses, Thutmose, emerged from silence. Grammar rose where mystery had lingered. The temples spoke again. The 19th century became a pilgrimage of scholars. Auguste Mariette uncovered the Serapeum at Sahara and founded a service to guard monuments. Flinders Petrie measured shards and strata, teaching the discipline of context. Painters and epigraphers copied tomb walls at Thebes, preserving narratives of the night hours of the sun. In 1922, Howard Carter opened a sealed doorway in the Valley of the Kings. Gold flickered through dust. Within lay Tutankhamun, wrapped in linen and eternity. The world gasped at splendor, yet the deeper marvel lay in the inscriptions, spells promising resurrection, affirming that Osiris rises and the sun returns. The first time had not vanished. It had waited. Temples yielded their encyclopedias. Edfu's inscriptions described Horus combating Seth's chaos. Dendra's ceilings mapped the stars as living deities. Philae whispered that the river itself is liturgy. In the 20th century, the rising waters behind the Aswan High Dam threatened to submerge ancient sanctuaries. The world responded. Engineers cut Abu Simbel into blocks and raised the seated colossi of Ramesses 2 above the floodline. The temples of Philae were relocated to higher ground on Agilkia Island, so that Isis would not drown in modernity's reservoir. Stone moved. Memory endured. Across millennia, Egypt's sacred architecture has been carved, plastered, crossed, recited, translated, dismantled, relocated, deciphered. Yet beneath each transformation lies the same quiet conviction. That words matter. That balance sustains. That even when gods are asked to sleep, the habits they taught remain in the marrow of a people. The temples fell silent. Then they spoke again, and in their speech, the river continues. The rescue did not unfold as mere labor of engineers and cranes. It became an act of will against erasure, a deliberate defiance of the slow hunger of water and the indifferent arithmetic of time. Across the burning valleys and sandstone escarpments of Egypt, men and women knelt before fading walls with lamps and sheets of thin paper, tracing signs that had nearly surrendered to wind. Each carved falcon, each reed, each seated god was followed by a trembling beam of light, as if illumination itself were a sacred rite. Photographers fixed pigments before they surrendered to dust. Epigraphers moved like surgeons beside ancient stone, preserving arteries of meaning before the flood could silence them forever. What rose from this effort was not only conservation, it was Ma'at made visible, measure and devotion working in harmony. The old principle that balance sustains the world found modern hands willing to uphold it. Time had threatened, water had advanced, yet human resolve answered. Scholars cataloged, translated, debated. Their seriousness would not have seemed foreign to the priestly schools of Heliopolis or Memphis. In quiet rooms filled with dust and dictionaries, arguments over grammar and theology carried the same intensity as rituals once performed before incense and flame. Yet something else began to stir beyond the discipline of scholarship. A second life of Egyptian myth took shape, half truth, half longing. In the capitals of Europe, obelisks were raised beside rivers that knew no Nile. The monolith from Luxor obelisk rose in Paris, its hieroglyphs gazing over colder waters. A pair known as Cleopatra's Needle and Cleopatra's Needle stood in London and New York City, silent spines of the sun transplanted into foreign skies. They were fragments of another cosmos, carried north like relics of an extinguished star. Museums filled with granite and hammered gold. Amulets shaped as bees and protective deities stared calmly from behind glass. Their expressions seemed gentle now, domesticated by labels and catalog numbers. Yet once they had guarded tombs against eternity itself. Opera houses staged Ida with trumpets and moonlit courts, as though grand orchestration might resurrect Memphis for a single evening. Secret societies draped themselves in gilded symbols and whispered riddles beneath candlelight. Novelists borrowed scarabs and pyramids, weaving them into fables of hidden wisdom. The public devoured translations of the Book of the Dead, versions sometimes closer to Victorian longing than to ancient prayer, and loved them nonetheless. Meanwhile, the sober tide of philology advanced with quiet authority. Spell numbers were revised, readings corrected. The coffin texts were edited with precision. Maps from the Book of the Two Ways were traced from coffins resting in distant museums. Fancy yielded slowly to fidelity. Scholars explain the Nile not as miracle, but as climate, as solar pull and equatorial rain filling southern channels. And yet, even in this clarity, the best among them spoke of Heka without disdain. They understood that practical knowledge and metaphysical trust are not enemies. A civilization may hold engineering skill and sacred hope in the same steady hand. Modern Egypt claimed its inheritance not as ornament, but as authority. The Antiquities Service, founded by Auguste Mariette, became a national institution. Egyptian scholars read the stones of their own ancestors, teaching in universities that carried forward a lineage interrupted but not erased. The Great Museum in Cairo gathered a city of statues beneath one roof and prepared a home even nearer to the pyramids, where desert and memory meet. Laws guarded the valley's ancient goods, permitting departure only by loan and treaty, as if the land itself had learned to defend its bones. Tourists arrived in thousands. Guides blended story and fact in rhythms shaped by the river. In Coptic churches scattered across Cairo and the countryside, the old tongue survived in prayer. Months were recited by names known to the builders of Sahara. Within mosques that rise inside pharaonic courtyards, the call to prayer ascends beside columns that once watched ram-headed Ammonius pass in procession. The ancient theology did not return as cult, but as memory made plain, as sediment beneath the surface of daily life. A farmer weighing grain still speaks of balance. A judge insists upon straightness in measure. An engineer watching river gauges in summer carries the same quiet anxiety once felt by priests studying the Nilometer. The old religion persists not in temples, but in habits of mind, in reverence for stone weathered by millennia, in proverbs shaped by cycles of flood and drought. The myths endure because they remain functional. The Ennead of Heliopolis, the Ogdoad of Hermopolis, the Memphite doctrine of Ptah, the ascent of Ammonius in Thebes, the journeys of Ra through day and night, the suffering of Osiris, the vigilance of Horus, the feather of Maat balanced against the human heart. These are not curiosities. They are metaphors that still breathe. They teach that creation is not a singular event, but a daily renewal. That names anchor existence. That justice is equilibrium, not noise. That mourning can mend what violence has broken. That order and storm must negotiate their fragile truce. At dawn upon the Giza Plateau, when the sun ignites the edges of stone with fire, visitors feel what the first builders felt, not triumph, but alignment. When a child presses her face to museum glass to study a blue faience amulet, she gazes at protection made visible. When a scholar reads a spell copied 4,000 years ago and comprehends each word, the world contracts and deepens at once. The river continues to teach. Egypt did not vanish. Its gods accepted new names. Its language survived in Coptic prayer. The calendar still keeps rhythm with the flood. A broken stone at Rosetta allowed temples to speak again. Their voices recovered from silence. Stories resurfaced with dates intact, with kings and hymns and invocations restored to breath. Engineers lifted Abu Simbel and placed Philae upon higher ground, a rescue governed by measure and memory. The statues stand. The text can be read. The Nile still shines at dawn, and in that light it becomes clear. The first morning is never distant. It waits behind every sunrise, patient as stone, eternal as balance.